So if you look at companies like Netflix or Meta or Google or other companies that supposedly have all the data, they are also some of the biggest employers of anthropologists and social scientists in the world. And our core idea is really this sort of premise that if you want to understand people, you need to understand their worlds. You need to understand what's around them. When we started working with Lego in 2004, they had huge deficits, and they'd had deficits for years. They had basically been really threatened by what was going on in the toy industry, which, they kept trying to launch new kinds of toys to try to catch sort of consumer sentiment. So they would say, oh, we need to sort of do what Mattel does with Barbie, and let's go in that direction. PlayStation and other things that come out, and they have games that can hook you, and you just open it up and you can play. That's amazing. We need to do that. No one wants to just sit and put Lego bricks together forever. So they tried line extension after line extension, new product idea after new product idea, and they were all failing. And then a new CEO came in, and he asked us to come and basically sort of take a fresh look at what was going on. So we went out and we did a big study of how do kids play? So rather than asking the normal business question, which is how do we sell more toys, we tried to understand what is it that's going on when kids play? Why do they play? What is play nowadays? And that's where we come back to the shoe. So we saw a lot of things in our research, and we asked kids a lot of questions, we played with them and so on. And then there's this one 12-year-old boy in Germany who, when we asked him, what's your most prized possession? And we sort of expected that he would then show us one of his favorite toys or maybe one of his computer games and so on. And instead, he showed us this shoe. And we were sort of like, okay, that's odd. What's so special about this shoe? And he explained to us, well, this is the shoe I've worn as I've been practicing kickflips on my skateboard in my backyard for the past several years. And I'm really, really proud that I can now finally do a kickflip. And if you look at the shoe, you can see the sort of scuff marks on the top of the shoe rather than the bottom of the shoe. And in his world, that was basically evidence of the thousands of kickflips he'd been doing on a skateboard in his backyard. So we looked at that and we said, that's interesting. So of all the things you could say that's sort of the most important thing to you, you're pointing to something that basically proof that you have just been doing the same thing over and over again for ages in your backyard. And what it shows is that kids don't want toys that are easy necessarily. They don't just want toys that are right there for you and open up a world like a lot of computer games do. They want to be challenged. They want to be able to show off their skills. They want toys that are as complex as the world around them. They want to be pushed out of their comfort zone, and they want hierarchy. These are all sort of insights that really sort of ran counter to the classic idea of toys should be fun. It should be all about just joy and fun and so on. We said, no, actually, toys can be hard. And that sort of core idea has powered Lego for 15 years since then, right? So once they had that, we could see, oh, you should cut all these line extensions. You should go back and just focus on the brick. And then that core idea of building bricks, putting things together, that's the core DNA, right? You can take that and you can make a movie around it. You can take that and you can make computer games around it. But it should all be focused on this fundamental premise that play should challenge you. So that's an example of a single piece of thick data that shows you a new world as an executive. You can collect thick data with kids and so on, but to this question of how do we then combine thick data and a thick data understanding of the world with big data? Well, a few years ago, we did sort of a fun little study to try and sort of put the combination of big data and thick data to the test. So we decided to take on what is one of the biggest sort of data science challenges today. Credit card fraud is a billion-dollar problem for banks across the world. And at the time when we did the study, it was a rapidly growing problem because you had new chips and so on coming out that weren't quite sort of in consumers' pockets yet. So there were not all the safety features that we have today. And the banks had armies of data scientists basically trying to find fraudsters by looking at the transaction data, right? So they look at your transactions and they try to find patterns and say, oh, that transaction seems fraudulent. You bought something in a different country or in an irregular pattern. That's likely to be a credit card fraud. And we said, well, okay, great. That's the classic approach. We can ask the big data what it can tell us about the fraudsters, and we can go down that route. But what if we turn that problem on its head for a second? What if we ask the fraudsters what they can tell us about the big data that we should be looking at? We went out and we spent time with people who commit credit card fraud. So that means spending a lot of time in slightly shady warehouses and other places across the US. It means spending a lot of time on the dark web. And it's, by the way, something that's a fairly established practice if you look at the sociology of deviance and so on. So it's something that in academia is common practice, but in a business world is not very common practice. And it's interesting because the folks who commit credit card fraud, they are actually proud of what they do. They want to talk about it. So of course they don't want to talk about it to the FBI. So you have to give them some assurances that you're not going to give them away and so on. But they are proud to actually share and give a window into the world that they're part of. So we spent a lot of time with credit card fraudsters across the US, both online and in person. Some of them were in sort of little fraud rings, you could say. Others were sort of loan operators. And the common theme that we saw with all of these folks is, I should mention that the folks we looked at were basically people who would buy credit card data on the dark web. So they would buy, let's say, 10,000 credit cards that had been stolen in a hack somewhere, and then they would try to use them. And you would think of credit card fraud, they're probably driving around their Ferraris or it's big organized crime. That's not the case. 90% of credit card fraudsters are basically folks who are sort of struggling to get by. And what you see when you meet them is that credit card fraud is a grind. It's really, really hard work. It's basically folks who are fairly smart, gifted folks who grew up in not great circumstances and therefore feel like they have a choice between working at McDonald's or selling drugs. And they feel like selling drugs seems high risk and takes me down a path that I don't want to go in my life. McDonald's, that's too much of a grind. So here's this thing that's right in between. But again, it's really hard work, and people see it as really, really risky. And once you understand that, like the whole sort of calculus around fraud changes, right? Because you realize, so what we need to do is not necessarily just to sort of find them and identify each fraudulent transaction. If we just make it more difficult, then it won't be worth it anymore. So there are lots of things you can do to make fraud more difficult that won't necessarily catch the fraudster, but will just make it more complicated. And then we sort of looked at, okay, great, so what does that look like? Well, how can we make it more complicated? What are the pain points for someone who commits credit card fraud? One of the ones that was sort of more significant was that we could see that these folks, as long as they're sitting behind a computer screen, they feel safe. They feel like, you guys can throw any kind of algorithm at me and, a month later, I'll be one step ahead. I'll come up with something new. I'll come up with a workaround, right? But there's one element of their process where they can't hide behind the computer screen anymore. And that's when they've bought goods online that they need to pick up somewhere. Someone has to go and physically pick up those goods. How do they do that? So that's the one piece of their process where there's sort of a limited set of options, right? So what do fraudsters do? They send it to abandoned homes. They send the goods to P.O. boxes. They send the goods to homes of folks who are out of town. Particularly the abandoned home one was at the time the sort of most popular. And once we saw that, we were like, oh, but that's an easy thing for us to fix. All the folks who've been fighting credit card fraud have just been looking at the transaction data. So all we need to do is we need to give them access to a new data set. So rather than arming the data scientists just with all the transaction data about what you buy, we need to also give them access to real estate data about where those goods going, right? And that data exists. And the lesson here, of course, is not that the data scientists are dumb and the humanities folks are smart. It's that the data scientists had been looking at one data set, right? Their world was the transaction data that they'd been given. And when you sort of open up and look at the context for a second, all of a sudden you realize that's not the whole universe of data. right? There's a world outside of that you can pull in.